As a poet, writer, radio host, and former editor-in-chief and literary critic, Jack Foley has enjoyed a prolific career dedicated to the written word. His celebrated works reflect the mindset of a strenuously active intellectual. For Mr. Foley, who grew up in Port Chester, New York, his awakening to poetry when he was young was similar to a kind of baptism. He was 15 years old when somebody suggested he read a poem by Thomas Gray. He had long been interested in writing, playing guitar, and writing lyrics, but he didn't think that he was all that interested in poetry. However, he went to the library and took out a book of the English poet's works, read aloud Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, and immediately fell in love. Mr. Foley felt as if he knew the poet on a cosmic level and that he was incarnated inside of him. It inspired him to sit down and write his own, completely imitating the poem he had just read, and he was impressed with himself, compelled to get back into the headspace that Gray put him in and create more. The poem he read dealt with the dissolution of boundaries, and although Gray was an 18th century aristocrat and he was a 20th century working class kid, he found echoes of himself in the work in a way he had never experienced before, and through the beauty of language he'd never heard before. This turning point led to his decision to pursue a career in poetry. In 1963, Mr. Foley earned a Bachelor of Arts in English Literature from Cornell University in Ithaca, and then continued his education in the same subject at the University of California, Berkeley, where he received his Master of Arts in 1965 and studied as a recipient of the Woodrow Wilson Fellowship. Mr. Foley had met his late wife, Adelle Foley, in 1960 while attending Cornell, and they were married a year later. In the subsequent years after college, Mr. Foley published several poems and articles, but it wouldn't be until 1985, at 45 years old, that he and his work were noticed in a prominent way. That was the year he had his first poetry reading alongside Adele, the first of many multi-voiced performance pieces that they did together that became an essential and memorable aspect of his career. These presentations were made up of combined voices, sometimes in unison, overlapping and bouncing off of one another to create urgent, frantic, exciting, and musical readings of these works. Mr. Foley was always grateful to Adele, who passed away from stomach cancer in 2016, because she not only stood by him through the years in which he was a struggling unknown in the field, but believed in his work and never complained. Following her death, he found a new love and performance partner in girlfriend Sangi Land, the daughter of poet Julie Rogers and the stepdaughter of poet David Meltzer. Starting in 1987 with the publication of his book of poetry, Letters, Lights, Words for Adele, Mr. Foley entered into a prolific, decade-spanning career as an author, with 17 poetry books, 5 books of criticism, stories, and a 2-volume chrono-encyclopedia entitled Visions and Affiliations, A California Literary Timeline, Poets and Poetry, 1940 to 2005, to his name, not to mention several works as an editor and contributor. Some of these contributions include Inciting Big Joy in 1993, Oh, Her Blackness Sparkles, The Life and Times of the Batman Art Gallery, San Francisco, 1960 to 1965, in 1995, Exiles in 1996, Foley's Books, California Rebels, Beats, and Radicals, in 2000, The Dancer and the Dance, A Book of Distinctions, in 2008, and Grief Songs in 2016. He and his work, Vision and Affiliations, a 1,300-page behemoth that chronicles post-war California literature, beloved by the few who read it when it sold about 200 copies, though it quickly vanished from shelves and sight, were the focuses of the 2019 book Jack Foley's Unmanageable Masterpiece, published by Monongahela Books and edited by Dana Gioia and Peter Whitfield. Speaking on Mr. Foley's work, Dana Gioia has said, "It represents the rare commodity, genuinely avant-garde poetry. He takes the polyphonic forms of Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot and pushes them into possibilities open only to performance-based art. This is experimental poetry with depth and intelligence as well as intensity. Poet and author Janine Kanan called Mr. Foley a brilliant critic and a unique poet whose work energetically records the disintegration of the patriarchy. Fellow poet Michael McClure referred to him as a firebrand experimentalist, and he holds his torch high so the reader can have more light. While Christopher Bernard, a poet and critic, ranked him as one of American poetry's essential thinkers and practitioners. In January 2021, he published The Light of Evening, A Brief Life of Jack Foley, which was followed up by his February release of A Backward Glance or Traveled Roads, a reminiscence and a presentation of the various forms I have employed throughout my long, long life. Speaking on his craft, he has said, "Writing involves a mixture of intelligence and intuition. I think the greatest writers allow these two qualities to dance together." A majority of his poetry books came with corresponding CDs and cassette tapes containing audio of Mr. Foley and his wife performing the works. Together, they often appeared on television programs. He was the co-editor and a contributor of New Poetry from California, Dead Requiem, in 1998, editor and a contributor of The Fallen Western Star Wars in 2001, and editor of All, a James Broughton reader in 2006, among others. He has also been a columnist with the Alsop Review, a poetry zine, since 1998. Since 1988, Mr. Foley has served as the host and executive producer of Cover to Cover with Jack Foley, a program on the Berkeley radio station KPKA-FM that celebrates the art of poetry, consisting of interviews and poetry performances. He has served on numerous organizations throughout his career, including the Modern Language Association. He served as program director of Penn Oakland from 1990 to 1997 and secretary of the San Francisco chapter of the National Poetry Association from 1989 to 1995. In recognition of his numerous career achievements, Mr. Foley was bestowed with the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Berkeley Poetry Festival in 2010, which the poet considers the highlight of his career. The ceremony involved a poetry reading with Adele, to whom Mr. Foley said he owed everything. It was as much her day as it was his, he later noted. That same year, Berkeley designated a Jack Foley Day in June. Mr. Foley leaves behind a legacy of passion, intellectualism, determination, and a deep understanding of the world around him, as well as those who inhabit it, and of course, his beautiful words. In his poem Elegy, Roy Lisker, he writes, "These years, let's put them all together in a movie and run them backwards till we reach that blackness, that unknowable stuff at the beginning, and say that moving into it is nothing more than entering a dark room, and moving into it until you find the light."